The neon sign of the last stop oasis buzzed with a low, dying hum that Sam Goodson felt right in his molars, a persistent vibration that seemed to synchronize with the anxious rhythm of his own pulse. It was exactly 2:14 a.m., a dead zone of time where the world outside ceased to exist, leaving only this fragile island of glass and fluorescent light afloat in an ocean of absolute blackness. Highway 9 stretched out from the property line in both directions, a desolate ribbon of cracked asphalt swallowing the Idaho wilderness, entirely empty of headlights for the last 3 hours. Sam leaned heavily against the laminate counter, the stale smell of burnt coffee and chemical floor cleaner clinging to the back of his throat. To combat the encroaching drowsiness, his left thumb instinctively traced the contours of the heavy silver signet ring resting on his finger. It was an old piece of jewelry, deeply scarred with decades of scratches and bearing a dull, weathered patina. But its solid weight was a comfort, a tangible memento left to him by his grandfather, a man who had always told him that pure silver kept a man tethered to the truth when the world tried to lie to him. Sam didn't truly understand those cryptic words as a child, but tonight, surrounded by an oppressive, suffocating silence that felt almost predatory, the cool metal against his skin was the only thing keeping him grounded. The station itself was old, a relic of the late 70s, with creaking floorboards beneath the cheap linoleum and a layout that created too many blind spots between the aisles of stale snacks and motor oil. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose aluminum molding on the roof and causing the overhead lights to flicker for a fraction of a second. Sam sighed, rubbing his tired eyes with the palms of his hands, wondering for the 100th time why he had taken the graveyard shift at a station so isolated that even the radio signals decayed into static before reaching it. He glanced up at the bank of 4 security monitors mounted above the register, their low-resolution black and white feeds casting a ghostly pale glow across his face. 3 of the screens showed nothing but empty space: the deserted side alley where the dumpster sat, the dark interior of the car wash bay, and the shadowed rows of the grocery aisles inside. But the 4th monitor, which displayed Pump 3 at the far edge of the lot, was behaving erratically, lines of aggressive white static tearing across the screen like jagged teeth. A sudden, metallic thud from the far side of the gravel lot made Sam flinch, his hand instantly dropping from his face as his body went rigid. It wasn't the sound of the wind. It was the distinct, heavy impact of a boot hitting the steel base of a fuel pump. His eyes locked onto the flickering monitor for Pump 3, waiting for the static to clear, his breath catching in his throat as the distortion smoothed out to reveal a figure standing just outside the cone of amber light. The stranger was completely motionless, positioned with his back to the store, silhouetted against the encroaching tree line of the surrounding forest. Sam frowned, a cold prickle of unease washing over his neck as he realized the figure was wearing a heavy, dark canvas work jacket with a frayed collar, the exact same jacket Sam had bought from the local surplus store just last winter. Even from the grainy, distorted perspective of the camera, the man's physical build, the slight slouch of his shoulders, and the way he carried his weight on his right leg were uncannily familiar. Stepping out from behind the safety of the counter, Sam took a few cautious paces towards the reinforced glass storefront, his heavy boots clicking softly against the floor. He taps the button on the old analog intercom system, the microphone letting out a harsh, piercing whine before settling into a low hiss. "Hey buddy, we're currently closed for fuel maintenance until 5 a.m. You can't be hanging around the pumps," Sam called out, his voice sounding thinner than he intended as it broadcasted through the external speaker. The figure didn't flinch, didn't startle, and didn't offer a wave of apology. Instead, it remained perfectly rigid, as if it were a cardboard cutout placed in the gravel. The silence that followed was heavy, stretching out for several agonizing seconds, while Sam's hand hovered over the intercom button, his knuckles turning white. Then, with an agonizing and natural slowness, the person began to turn around toward the camera, the movement stiff and mechanical, like a joint's rusted mannequin being forced to rotate. Sam's breath completely hitched in his chest, a sudden and violent wave of vertigo washing over him as the figure's face came into the light of the pump. It was like looking into a corrupted, funhouse mirror that managed to get every physical detail right while entirely omitting the human soul beneath the skin. The entity on the screen possessed Sam's sharp, uneven jawline, Sam's messy, uncombed brown hair, and the distinct slight crookedness of his nose from an old high school sports injury. But its eyes were wrong. They were wide, entirely unblinking, the pupils dilated so fully that they swallowed the irises, reflecting the dim light of the gas station like the eyes of a nocturnal predator caught in a high-beam glare. Sam staggered back a step, his brain violently rejecting the visual data it was receiving, desperately trying to construct a logical explanation for why his own face was staring back at him from the dark lot. As if sensing his mounting terror, the thing that wore Sam's flesh slowly twisted its mouth into a horrific, impossibly wide grin that stretched past the natural boundaries of a human face. The skin around its cheeks tautened to the point of tearing, its jaw unhinging just a fraction too far with a sickening audible click that somehow carried through the faulty intercom. It stared directly into the lens of the security camera, mocking him, its expression a caricature of human emotion designed to induce madness. Then, maintaining that terrifying frozen smile, the creature slowly raised its left hand toward the camera lens, spreading its fingers wide to display its thumb. Molded directly into its grey, seamless skin was a perfect, fleshy imitation of his grandfather's silver signet ring, a grotesque growth that mimicked the metal right down to the specific scratches. Yet, it was made entirely of pale, dead flesh. The intercom gave a sharp, agonizing squeal, as if the electronics themselves were rejecting the sound, before cutting to a low, rhythmic scratching that sounded like fingernails dragging across ice. Sam stumbled backward against the metal cigarette rack, the plastic dividers rattling violently as his body collided with them, sending several packs tumbling to the floor. His heart was hammering so violently against his ribs that it produced a dull, physical ache in his chest, his eyes wide and watering as he refused to break contact with the monitor. The creature on the screen didn't advance toward the glass, nor did it attempt to run. Instead, keeping its horrific, unblinking gaze locked onto the lens, it simply took one smooth, backward step into the pitch-black void beyond the perimeter of Bump 3. It didn't fade into the shadows, it was instantly swallowed by them, dissolving into the night like ink dropping into black water, leaving behind only the empty concrete island and the erratic, dancing lines of white static. Panic, cold and sharp as a razor blade, finally broke through Sam's paralysis, and he lunged across the floor toward the front entrance. He slammed his body against the heavy glass door, throwing his weight into it as he twisted the brass deadbolt, the mechanism locking with a loud, metallic clack that offered absolutely no sense of security. With trembling fingers, he threw the secondary security latch and flipped the heavy iron deadbolt at the bottom of the frame, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that fogged up the glass in front of him. He peered out into the darkness, his eyes straining against the glare of the indoor fluorescents reflecting off the windows, realizing with absolute horror that he was completely isolated. The nearest town was a 40-minute drive through dense, unmonitored pine forest. His old pickup truck sat completely exposed in the side lot, and the air inside the station had suddenly dropped 20 degrees, turning his breath into faint puffs of white mist. It's a hallucination, just an extreme trick of the light and sleep deprivation, Sam muttered aloud, his voice sounding hollow, brittle, and entirely unconvincing in the vast, empty stillness of the store. He tightly gripped the silver signet ring on his left thumb with his right hand, squeezing it until the metal dug painfully into his skin, using the sharp localized pain to anchor his mind to reality. He knew the lore. His grandfather had spent years tracking the anomalous things that wandered the deep woods, whispering warnings about shapeshifters that stole a man's identity to destroy his sanity before harvesting his life. They can take your face, Sammy, but they can't replicate the purity of silver. It burns their false flesh, his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, a warning he had dismissed as the ramblings of a paranoid old man until this exact second. Suddenly, the landline phone mounted on the wall behind the counter began to ring, the harsh, electronic chime shattering the silence like a gunshot and causing Sam to leap nearly a foot off the ground. Sam froze, his entire body breaking out into a cold sweat as the phone rang a second time, then a third, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. Every primitive survival instinct screaming inside his brain told him to leave it alone, but the automated corporate logging system required him to answer internal store alerts, and the caller ID screen was blank, flashing only the words internal line. With a hand that shook so violently he nearly dropped it, Sam picked up the heavy plastic receiver and slowly brought it to his ear, keeping his mouth clamped shut, refusing to speak a single word. For a long, agonizing moment, there was no voice on the line, only the sound of heavy, wet breathing that had an unnatural, dual-toned resonance to it, as if two identical throats were inhaling at the exact same microsecond. Then, the speaker spoke, and the sound made Sam's stomach drop into a bottomless pit of terror. It was his own voice, perfect down to the slight rasp in the vowels and a specific Midwestern cadence, but dripping with a mocking rhythmic malice. "You forgot to lock the back storage bay, Sammy," the voice whispered, the tone carrying an intimate, terrifying familiarity that made Sam's skin crawl. Before he could pull the receiver away from his ear, the voice let out a wet, clicking laugh that sounded like dry teeth rapidly tapping together, followed by a wet tearing sound as if skin were being stretched too tight. The line went dead with a sharp click, but before Sam could fully process the threat, a heavy rhythmic thumping began directly above his head. Something massive, heavy and completely unbothered by the structural integrity of the building was dragging a heavy weight across the corrugated metal roof of the station, moving slowly toward the air vent right above the register. The metal beams of the ceiling groaned under the shifting weight, the dust of decades raining down in microscopic glittering flurries through the fluorescent light fixtures. Sam stood paralyzed behind the counter, his eyes locked onto the acoustic ceiling tiles as a rhythmic thud, drag vibrated to the structure, tracking a path directly toward the back office. His mind raced through the floor plan of the last stop oasis, realizing with a sickening jolt that the voice on the phone hadn't been lying. The old wooden loading door in the rear storage room had a faulty latch that always slipped when the wind blew hard enough. If that thing had been on the roof, it was using the height to scout an entry point, and the back room was a blind spot completely hidden from the front counter's view. He had to move, but his limbs felt heavy, anchored by a primal dread that warned him that stepping into the shadows of the aisles meant playing entirely into the entity's hands. Taking a deep, ragged breath that tasted of copper and ozone, Sam reached beneath the register and pulled out a heavy iron tire iron, the only weapon authorized by the station's absentee owner for night shift protection. The cold iron felt substantial in his right hand, but as his left thumb brushed against his grandfather's silver ring, he remembered the old man's specific journal entries about the Doppelganger. Iron will slow them, break their stolen bones, but it won't stop the regeneration. Only pure silver can sever the tether between their true form and their stolen skin. He looked down at the ring. It was heavy, but it wasn't a weapon. He couldn't kill a monster with a single piece of jewelry, unless he could somehow bring it into direct, prolonged contact with the creature's core. Suddenly, the overhead lights didn't just flicker, they went out completely, plunging the convenience store into an absolute, suffocating darkness that was instantly replaced by the eerie, battery-operated green glow of the emergency exit signs. In the dim green light, the rows of chip bags and plastic soda bottles transformed into jagged, crouching silhouettes, turning the familiar store into a labyrinth of shadows. From the back corridor, past the employee-only door, came a slow, deliberate creak of rusted hinges, followed by the wet, slapping sound of bare feet walking on cold concrete. Sam slunk low, utilizing the shadow of the candy display aisle to mask his movement as he began to slip toward the rear of the store, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his teeth. As he neared the corner of the beverage coolers, a whisper echoed from the darkness ahead, not from the hallway, but from the left side of the aisle, perfectly mimicking his own voice when he was terrified. "Sammy, help me. It's so cold out here. It took my skin, Sammy. Please look at me." The voice sobbed a pathetic, weeping imitation that sounded so genuine it nearly made him turn the corner. But Sam caught himself, his knuckles whitening around the tire iron as he noticed a detail that broke the illusion. The sobbing voice was perfectly looping every 6 seconds, like a broken audio file repeating its track. The entity wasn't just trying to kill him, It was systematically dismantling his sensory perception, forcing his brain to question what was real and what was a manifestation of its psychological assault. He peered around the edge of the shelving, his eyes adjusting to the deep green gloom, and saw a figure standing at the end of the aisle, its back completely turned to him. It was hunched over, its spine protruding against the fabric of the dark canvas jacket in a series of sharp, unnatural angles that no human skeleton could achieve. The creature was slowly raking its long, malformed fingers against the glass of the cooler door, leaving streaks of thick grey condensation that smelled faintly of rotting meat. "I know what you are," Sam whispered into the darkness, his voice tight but steady, refusing to let the tremor of fear dictate his words anymore. The figure froze instantly, the weeping sound cutting off in the middle of a syllable, replaced by that horrific, wet clicking noise of teeth tapping together in the dark. It didn't turn its head normally. Instead, its neck twisted a full 180 degrees over its shoulder with a succession of loud, dry pops like cracking knuckles. The face was an even worse distortion of Sam's features than before. The skin was sloughing off the cheekbones like wet paper, and the wide, black voids of its eyes leaked a dark, viscous fluid. "You're too late, Sammy," the creature hissed, its jaw unhinging to reveal rows of needle-thin, translucent teeth that didn't belong to any earthly animal. With an explosive, terrifying speed, the doppelganger dropped onto all fours, its limbs bending backward as it lunged down the narrow aisle directly toward him. Sam didn't hesitate. As the creature sprinted down the narrow aisle on inverted limbs, its grey skin scraping against the bottom shelves, he swung the tire iron with everything he had. The heavy metal bar connected with the side of the creature's stolen skull with a sickening hollow crack, the force of the blow throwing the doppelganger sideways into a display of motor oil cans. The entity let out a high-pitched, multi-tone screech that vibrated the glass cooler doors, but to Sam's horror, it didn't stay down. The crushed side of its face immediately began to bubble and reform, the grey flesh knitting back together with an unnatural, wet elasticity as it scrambled to its feet, its black eyes with an intense malicious intelligence. Sam scrambled backward toward the front counter, realizing with absolute certainty that his grandfather's warnings were entirely true. Conventional weapons were nothing more than a temporary delay. He needed a real weapon, something pure, but all he had was the small signet ring on his thumb, unless there was something else hidden within the station's old inventory. Ducking behind the heavy oak checkout counter, Sam ignored the frantic scratching of the creature trying to right itself in the aisle and lunged for his grandfather's old metal toolbox, which he kept under the desk for emergency repairs. With trembling hands, he dumped the contents onto the floor, rusted wrenches, plastic zip ties, and the heavy, tarnished silver welding rod his grandfather had used decades ago for specializing in antique radiator repairs. Sam picked up the rod, feeling the distinct heavy coldness of the high-purity silver alloy. It wasn't a blade, but it was long, solid, and pointed at the tip from where it had been previously cut. He quickly pulled his grandfather's signet ring off his thumb and pressed it firmly against the base of the rod, wrapping a thick layer of industrial duct tape around them both to forge a makeshift, silver-tipped pike. A sudden crash shattered the silence as the doppelganger leapt over the candy aisle, landing squarely on top of the counter, its jaw unhinged so wide that its mouth resembled a dark, cavernous void lined with needle teeth. It lunged downward, its malformed hands gripping Sam's canvas jacket, pinning him to the linoleum floor as its rotting, familiar face hovered mere inches from his own. "I will wear your life well, Sammy." The creature mocked, its voice a perfect, vibrating twin of his own as a drop of cold, grey fluid fell from its chin onto his cheek, burning like acid. Sam screamed through the pain, bringing his left hand up to wedge against the creature's throat to keep its snapping jaws away, while his right hand drove the makeshift silver pike upward with desperate, terrifying strength. The silver tip drove deep into the center of the entity's chest, right where a human heart would be. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The moment the silver pierced the stolen flesh, a blinding blue-white smoke hissed from the wound, smelling intensely of ozone and burning sulfur. The doppelganger let out a sound that wasn't human at all, a deafening, metallic roar of pure agony as the silver began to systematically dissolve the false flesh, turning his grey skin into ash that floated into the air. The creature convulsed violently, its grip slacking as the imitation of Sam's face began to melt away like hot wax, revealing a featureless, pitch-black void beneath. With a final, desperate shove, Sam kicked the thrashing monster off him. It stumbled backward into the glass storefront, shattering the massive window into 1,000 glittering shards before collapsing onto the gravel parking lot outside. By the time Sam managed to drag himself up to look through the broken window, the creature was gone, leaving behind only a pile of smoldering black ash, a ruined canvas jacket, and his grandfather's silver rod glowing faintly in the cool morning air.